Hello, Curry Coast. You are listening to the Daily Weekly, and I am your host, Dakotah Daily. Thank you for tuning in to KCIW 100.7. And right here at the top of the hour, I'd like to start with an acknowledgement that we are on the traditional and unceded territories of the Chetco and Tututni Native American people. I'd like to thank the ongoing work of the Northwest American Indian Coalition and everything they do to foster environmental and cultural stewardship here on the Wild Rivers coast. Additionally, I'd like to thank our show's sponsor, Rick McNamer. Now, today we have a very special guest. Hannah Green is calling from Eastern Canada, and Hannah is somebody who I work with at my project Teton Topo, and we're involved in all sorts of active wildfire management and risk reduction work here. Hannah remotely, obviously, and I live here in Brookings. But yeah, Hannah's a super smart gal and has a lot of interesting things to say. So I'm really excited to have her on the show. Hannah, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
How's the weather out there in Eastern Canada today?
Well, it's downpouring, which was unfortunate to see this morning considering it was 17 degrees yesterday, but that's just how it works up here.
Is 17 degrees warm?
It's spring weather for sure.
Yeah.
In the summertime up here, it can get to the 30s, so we're getting there.
Because to us, 17 and 30 are both abysmally cold.
Oh, right, you guys are not on...
100 is like a really hot, proper hot day.
Yeah, no, it's, I don't know what that translation is, but 17 degrees Celsius.
Yeah. Sounds comfortable. It sounds like you were enjoying it, at least.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, one of the things I was hoping to chat with you while I have you today is some of the research that you've been doing as the program you just finished, because we get to talk about science a lot during our day jobs, but it's oftentimes just things that we have going on and mostly just a list of things that we have to do. And that's kind of our day in and day out. But I haven't ever heard very much about the research that you've just been wrapping up over the last year as you've started working for me.
No, yeah, I'd love to talk about it. So I graduated with my master's in environmental management in October. And my thesis was in collaboration with the Gespegawagi Institute of Natural Understanding, which is a Mi'kmaq environmental group that's kind of at the northern tip of the province that I'm in. And they were working with me to try and develop a water temperature prediction model that they are hoping to use to inform their decision-making process during fieldwork seasons and trying to help protect Atlantic salmon population by way of what habitats they use on the water. So I use the model to predict how cold thermal refuges are. And thermal refuges are just cold water patches on rivers that salmon will utilize in the summer months to stop themselves from experiencing stress and mortality. And especially with climate change and the changes that come with that, those are habitats that are going to be quite important and are right now in terms of protection. So they were very, very kind as to share what they know, their traditional ecological knowledge and their own field work, and collaborating with me. And then I used my GIS knowledge to help them answer that question. And I think this is their first year of implementation with that model that I created. So very excited to see what that looks like come September. But yeah, that's kind of where we're at right now with that.
That's really rad that they're taking it and they're directly turning around and able to operationalize the model.
Absolutely.
Okay, I have so many questions. So one of my first questions is I'm curious about the context and the need for this model kind of on the onset of your research. Was there an existing model that wasn't working for their needs, or was this the first time with all of this context that somebody's tried to actually model these ecosystem dynamics?
I'm definitely not the first to create this kind of model. It's something that's becoming more frequent. I know on a couple other watersheds in New Brunswick, there are other researchers that have began creating these models. But mine was the first one done on the Restigouche River watershed, which is where they're located. That's the traditional territory that they've been working on. Um, Trying to think of what else. Yeah, it's becoming a greater need, especially to decrease costs in terms of funding. It helps kind of do these models and think out of the field first, and then be like, okay, I can identify where these cold spots might be
Mm-hmm.
based on certain landscape attributes, and then going out to those spots first instead of doing a full field survey of a tributary, if that makes sense.
So how much of your process was tinkering on the model itself, and how much of it was taking inputs and putting them into a model that already exists and kind of running it and analyzing it for that area?
Most I built it from scratch. So a lot of it was kind of data mining for all of the geospatial data I needed. So that took about, I would say, 6 months of data mining and then tinkering with the models to kind of get the results sorted out and make sense. Took about a month, and we had some pretty good results at there were two types. So we had the global model, which was the full watershed, and then we had reach models, which just looked at the 7 different tributaries within the watershed. Because spatially, landscape attributes in terms of how well they are used as predictors, it changes. So things like I'm trying to think of an example here. If, for example, I looked at how agricultural runoff may affect water temperature, but that was only at the reach level, because at the watershed scale, the effect was very, very minimal. So it didn't really make sense to have it there. So it was a lot of trying to figure out which, based on previous studies, which attributes or which landscape attributes would be best at what spatial scale.
Wow. Cool. Yeah. I mean, I imagine 6 months of just data mining and building a project from scratch. That's a pretty huge endeavor.
We are pretty lucky, though, in New Brunswick. Our government has provincial-wide free data sets for quite a bit of this information. So I'm definitely lucky that way. There were some other ones that were a little bit hard to find, or data that I received from GINU, or that they didn't want, or not that they didn't want, but they were only comfortable sharing with me at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Of course. So it was a lot of
That's
fun, though. I can't complain.
that's a really interesting point you made, and it's something that comes up in the work that you and I are doing. And I'll just give a little bit of context for some of the listeners. Hannah and I are part of a project that does GIS, which is essentially modern map making. It stands for Geospatial Information Systems, and we are GIS technicians or GIS specialists or GIS analysts, kind of depending on the day. And we specifically focus on supporting rural and Indigenous communities with GIS systems and GIS mapping. And my background is in wildfire suppression, and you're hearing about Hannah's background right now. So we bring these two different focuses and skill sets to work oftentimes with Native American groups. And this whole piece about data sovereignty is a really interesting one, and it comes up in the work that we're doing here in Curry County a lot, with kind of who is the gatekeeper for what information and who are they comfortable with that being shared with. And we have to be really, really careful about this geospatial information, which is GPS points or its boundaries. And I'm curious, Hannah, because that came up in your work, if you could talk a little bit about what that data sovereignty piece was like for you.
Yeah, so on my end, I didn't deal with as much. I didn't deal with a lot of sensitive information. But the key thing with my projects was that we had to, because the data that they collected was done solely through them. And I'm trying to tread lightly with what I say, just because it's very political, like
Yeah.
very political up here sometimes. Just there are some people who are very interested in this specific data set who believe that they may be entitled to know what the data is, which isn't necessarily the case, because on the flip side, these people also don't feel comfortable or aren't willing to then reciprocate that with GINU or with other Indigenous organizations in the areas. So it can turn into a very back and forth, like who owes, like feeling very entitled to this data when they're not. So just being very sensitive with like who you share this information with and why is very, 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 very important. I don't know if that's making much sense.
Yeah. So it sounds like the non-tribal or non-Indigenous folks sometimes feel like they should just have access to all of the data, regardless of kind of whether they're willing to cooperate, vice versa. And one thing that I think might be confusing for some folks is why, if I'm assuming this data is something like temperature or, observations of different species, these seem like things that on the surface might seem like somewhat apolitical. Like why does it matter how many fish we're seeing where, and why isn't that something that everybody can just look at? And I imagine that's kind of the perspective that folks are coming across when they're like, we're entitled to this data, just let us see it. Can you speak a little bit to why, maybe what some of the hesitancy is around sharing this data and what the intention is with having a little bit more security around it?
Yeah, so it's interesting because what I've gathered through my talks with actually, if anybody is interested, her name is Dr. Carol Ann Gillis, and she is amazing. She's the scientific director at GINU, and she does amazing work in terms of salmon research and watershed research and kind of all of anything freshwater related, data sovereignty, and all that kind of stuff. But one of the main issues is that there are quite a few instances where it's called, what she calls it is fly in, fly out research, where researchers will come into a certain traditional territory or watershed or whatever it might be, collect their data, and then leave and write an academic article and publish it and get the credit for it without mentioning or collaborating with the Indigenous communities that are on that land base. Or, for example, collecting data on the Restigouche watershed and then not sharing it with the community, like feeling like this is my data for me only, but you need to share your data with me. So it's not reciprocated in that way. So, and this obviously goes back to the beginning of when, the settlers were coming over from Europe and colonizing North America, with just a distrust of, there's still a lot of distrust between the groups here and both the government and other, for example, researchers just not collaborating well. So it's causing a lot of, or is, for example, the government not believing believing the findings of GINU, for example. So like what I mean by that is on this river, historically, there have always been, and I'm just going to segue a little bit, there's always been Atlantic sturgeon on this river. There's traditional knowledge, historical knowledge, cultural knowledge that they've been on this river, but the government is telling them that no, this is not true. They actually have never been here. And in the past 10 years, local fishermen from this community have caught Atlantic sturgeon by bycatch, and like you're literally holding it up right to them, being like, we found this on this river, and they still will turn around and say, no, that's not true.
Wow.
So I think it boils down to feeling very protective and just from, hundreds of years of mistrust. It's like, you haven't proved to us that we can trust you with our data. So we don't feel, unless you are willing to openly collaborate on both ends, then unfortunately, this is just the way it's going to be, which I 100% understand.
Yeah, I really appreciate the way you laid that context out. And I think you did a really good job explaining that. It would be really nice if there was full transparency across the board, because if we were operating on the base assumption collectively that everybody is interested in taking care of the environment, then there wouldn't really be a reason to hold this data about where certain species are or what temperatures are changing secretly. But it's pretty blatant that when the government says there's not this kind of fish in this kind of river, despite thousands of years of cultural evidence and literally people today catching that fish, it becomes clear that there might be other political incentives other than just the truth, the evidence of what's going on in an ecosystem that become important. And these lead to people being concerned about who has access to what data and how they use it.
Exactly. And I don't want to remain pessimistic, because things are definitely changing. I think Eastern Canada has been, compared to, British Columbia, we're very slow to get up to the level of truth and reconciliation that's occurring on the western side of North America, or on the western side of Canada.
Yeah.
But I do see changes happening. Like collaborative committee meetings that I've been to, up on the Restigouche, with every single stakeholder possible. It's become a requirement that if you are doing research on this watershed, you have to attend and share your findings with this committee.
That's cool.
So it opens up a lot of doors for so much collaboration that otherwise would probably never happen, because, unless you're actually meeting people face to face, you wouldn't know that they're doing anything on that watershed. Yeah. So things are definitely looking up and getting better slowly, but it's a very, very, very long process.
That's really cool. I mean, I think that measure to make it where you must engage with the Indigenous community is a really powerful first step in that direction.
Mm-hmm. And it also helps to, what's that word? It helps to minimize scientific replication. So if you're going to this committee meeting, you have your findings. For example, say if you're doing for example, a water prediction model, and someone else from, say, for example, Quebec, which is the bordering province, is doing a very similar project to you, you can then collaborate with each other. Like, this is what I've found, this is what I've found. And then it helps to stop that replication of data. And then kind of boils down everything to being, okay, we know that this exists, so we don't need to go out and do our own version of this data set. Why would we do that if it already exists?
Yeah. So that experience with the Atlantic sturgeon that you were talking about, it reminds me of actually why I originally learned what GIS was and became interested in it. And it's because I was living in British Columbia and I was doing my undergrad there, and I wanted to do a project that was going to be interesting and useful for the Taloquiet Nation out there, which is having problems with Atlantic salmon as well, except for maybe it's the opposite problem, that there's too many Atlantic salmon being farmed on the West Coast in the Pacific Ocean, which it's leading to the extinction of the Pacific salmon. And I was studying sociology at the time, and I was like, yeah, can I research or read or do something more in the like qualitative world that would be helpful for y'all in this context around salmon? And they had all of this mapping of populations that they wanted to do. And I was like, well, I don't really know how that works. But they said, you're still in your undergrad, go take some classes on it. This is really what would be helpful for us. Because at the time, Alex Morton, who's a champion on the Vancouver Island for Pacific salmon populations, had done a study where she took 100 different samples of fish and sent them to she split up each of the samples and sent them to independent laboratories all across the planet. I mean, in every continent. She sent these samples and tested them for the virus that was in the salmon farms that was spreading to the wild populations and causing extinctions. And every single sample came back positive, and she sent the other half of the samples that she split to Canada's Department of Fisheries and Oceans, and 0% of them came back with any trace of the virus. So there was all of this kind of similar to what you were talking about with the sturgeon, of just we're operating off of two different data sets. And I think it's been really interesting for me as somebody who, it's easy to look at science kind of as objective and as apolitical, and science is the methodical and systematic. It's just a system of observations. That's what science is. It's just a system of making observations in an organized way. And you would think, okay, how is that political? But it becomes really clear, especially when you're working in these environmental and like cultural stewardship contexts, that the facts and the spatial data actually are totally political tools.
100%. 100%. And it's, it's very, you get down to the nitty gritty of, articles and what data means and stuff. Again, you got to look out for certain things. Because data can't, you can't dispute raw data. It's like raw data is raw data. I can go out and measure water temperature and I can say, okay, this is what it is. It's when you get into interpreting that data where you have to be aware of a couple things. Like, for example, who's funding that project, right? What are their motivations? I know that that's a little bit of a noticeable thing that I've come to realize in academia, is that you have to still, yes, science is objectively, if you have your raw data, that's just what it is. But you do have to think for yourself, like, okay, what do these results mean? Who wants them? Why did they want them? And then you got to kind of infer, like, okay, is that informing their own interests? If that makes sense.
Yeah.
Or not? But yeah.
One thing. Yeah, go ahead.
No, that was it. That was all.
I was going to tie it back to some of the projects that you and I are working on right now in Curry County, because it's been really, really interesting for me to see how kind of some of this people feeling like they need to secure or keep their data private has been coming into play. And there's a couple of things that I think are really interesting. One is that because of the work that you and I are involved in here around cultural resource mapping, I've had to learn a ton about the State Historic Preservation Office, which is how archaeological data is stored and protected in the United States. And the SHPO, otherwise known as the SHPO, is an old system that has a lot of problems on it. And my first experience of it was that when I was traveling around as a part of GIS for wildfire suppression efforts, we had experiences where a bulldozer driver would completely plow over a archaeological site, like maybe a Native American burial site. And they didn't want to do that. But the problem is that in the middle of summer, there's not enough wildfire resources. And during the peak of some summers, fires are starting and there's just no response, because every single person who's a contractor or who is trained to be doing wildfires already deployed, and there are not enough archaeologists. And a certified SHPO archaeologist is the only person on an incident management team that has access to the archaeological data. So people end up destroying stuff just because our system is built and it's under-resourced. It's also interesting that if you have one SHPO officer, they all of a sudden, they have this huge political power for an entire region. And I've definitely heard stories of people not being able to do any sort of environmental management or cultural stewardship work in an area, essentially because this one person in this one office has so much power of how they kind of designate how the surveying happens or how much NEPA has to be done, or they can just not show up and not support the project, which means that it kind of gets stuck in SHPO territory. And it's also interesting that I don't think that from the state and from the federal government, even federally recognized tribes, but especially not federally recognized tribes or Native American groups, have any sort of support for managing their own data and having data sovereignty. So it's been interesting to kind of watch in the work that you and I are doing these alternative systems. And it sounds like Canada is having some success actually in a government supported way, but here more so what I've seen is kind of like, okay, we're just going to have our own scientists. We're going to have our own data management because the United States government has total lock and key on all the archaeological data and has made it like pretty much impossible to cooperate with it.
Yeah. Which makes me quite sad, because to be successful in all of these different projects and managing, our forests and natural resources, you can't do it without collaboration.
Yeah.
You will not see success if you remain in an individualistic mindset when it comes to managing resources. You have to be collaborative, and it's sad that it's not the case, and it's sad that funding isn't available to the degree that it should be available, or even being increased, especially today. Like, it's so important that we put our focus into these natural resources, because once they're and cultural resources, because once they're gone, kind of thing. Like,
totally.
Yeah.
It makes me really, really grateful, and just reminds me how special it is. The project that you and I are working on right now around wildfire, it's something that I've been experiencing here in Curry County, really, really brings people together, and it starts to lubricate the conversation. Not to say that there are still a lot of hard conversations to be had, and there are definitely tense moments, but I've been really personally inspired because I've seen more people come and actually sit down at the table and have a willingness to have these hard conversations about wildfire. I think it's obvious for a lot of reasons, but it kind of like lays bare all of this other stuff that we can get caught up in around the politics, because for a lot of people, wildfire is a life and death concern when we're living here in the WUI, if not like a huge economic concern or other personal interests. And it's been really, really cool to see, like, because in my experience, I have definitely seen industry and Native groups and agencies all be not even willing to have a conversation, which makes total sense. Like, for example, here in Oregon, our private landowners, as far as I understand it, aren't required to report if they find like bones or cultural artifacts, or realize that maybe there is a burial site or a former lodge site on their land. So there's all of this kind of like secrecy that happens, because if the tribes find out about it, obviously that's like really interesting to them, but there's not really much legal infrastructure to support it. And it's kind of just up to the private landowners. And it's really easy for people to kind of just turn a blind eye or collect the things and just keep them for themselves, which is extremely disrespectful culturally. But with this wildfire thing that we're experiencing now, and the workshop that we're doing with Tabitha from the Wild Rivers Coast Forest Collaborative and Katrina from the Northwest American Indian Coalition are a huge part of backing this project, where we're mapping out potential control lines, or we also call them sometimes potential operational delineations in Curry County, which are places where we're strategically choosing that could have a high likelihood of being successful spots to suppress a wildfire, good places to draw a line and stop a wildfire in the case of a wildfire suppression. We've been having what to me feels like unprecedented success at being able to bring together industry folks, Native folks, and agency folks, as well as community members, and having some really, really important conversations that are the first step towards doing some of this fuels reduction and wildfire risk reduction work here in Curry County, which has been for me just like a mind-blowing experience to see, like, when it really comes down to it and it becomes life or death, people show up and all of a sudden these things that we were worried of, I've literally seen this, in previous projects, somebody's like, oh, no, we can't give you that information, and pretty much hung up the phone on me when I've called. This is a real example that you and I have experienced over this last year. And then all of a sudden, when it becomes about protecting their backyard, that I've seen that same person turn around and say like, oh yeah, well, can I email you this information? Because wildfire is something that like really, it's so visceral out here in this part of the world, that it really kind of cuts some of those barriers to cooperation away, which has been cool for me to be able to be a part of that work for that reason.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny how when you're faced with that, how quickly everybody is very willing to collaborate. Yeah. But everybody has their own reasons for that collaboration too, right?
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, I mean, if everybody, if you can find common ground with everybody, then that's the first step into getting that, strong input and collaboration with those different types of stakeholders that are in the forest and stuff. Everybody, no matter who you are, will be affected by wildfire. That's just the way that it is. So it's important that everybody has their input in that regard, because everybody's going to be affected by it.
That was my experience in incident response, disaster response in general. Is I can't tell you how many times I heard people say like, wow, this disaster has really, really brought the community together. Like people are showing up, people are helping their neighbors out. And then the next thing I oftentimes hear come out of people's mouths is like, man, why can't we just come together like this without the town burning down? And it reminds me too of the work we're doing right now, where it's like, whether it's Atlantic sturgeon or whether it's wildfire risk reduction, like it's important to be taking care of the planet and be taking care of each other. And it's beautiful to see people come together when there are disasters and it does become life and death. And it also gives me a sense of like definitely shaking my fist and being like, gosh, like why can't we be doing this all the time? Can't we see that working together, if we're willing to kind of snap out of it a little bit, we have so much to gain from working together just as humans. Like maybe our political agenda won't be as furthered. Maybe the shareholders won't be as happy. Maybe I won't be keeping face in the social prestige that I have. But truthfully, like a happier planet is a happier human race, and happier and healthier human communities are better for everybody at a really base level. And I really believe that. And I feel like that's really the only result from genuine collaboration. So it's definitely something I'd like to see more of.
No, and same with me as well. I mean, and this is a little bit of a tangent, but kind of on the same kind of leeway, I've had a really cool opportunity, because prior to working with you and at Tidron Topo, I did not have as much knowledge on wildfires and prescribed burns, because that just wasn't my wheelhouse. I was, I'm a I'm a salmon girl. Like that's where my, that's where my knowledge lies. But I grew up, in British Columbia as well, and I'm no stranger to wildfires. I have noticed in the past, I would say 10 years, it's definitely gotten very bad. And it's not if there's going to be a bad forest fire, it's how early is it coming this year? Like, is it going to be April? But I've had a really cool opportunity now with learning what I've learned from you and from everybody that we've collaborated with, to then share that knowledge up here to people who don't quite understand or just don't have any prior knowledge in wildfires. Like that prescribed burns aren't inherently a bad thing. I think when people think about forest fire, like obviously forest fires, ones that are man-made and are obviously not great. However, we also know that wildfires aren't inherently bad, because there's always been wildfires in the forests, and the Indigenous communities that are local, they know that as well. And there's cultural burning that's been happening since time in memoriam. And it's been really cool to be able to kind of spread that knowledge to people that I talk to and who maybe aren't familiar with the field at all, who have reservations about prescribed burns. They don't love the idea of having that in their backyard because all we've been told is wildfires are bad, period, end of
Yep.
story.
Yep.
Where it's a little bit more gray than that. It's not necessarily a bad thing. The forest is used to it. It's the intensity and the consistency in which they're happening. That's where the issue lies.
Yep.
Yeah.
I saw a really interesting, I should tune you into this because you would probably think it's interesting too, but sometimes I hesitate to send you like big things to read or watch outside of working hours because I know you already spend so much time on the computer looking at this stuff for work. But I'll send you this thing that I watched this webinar that was kind of a panel of like wildfire scientists through the Wildfire Data Commons, which is this cool group I've been participating in. And they essentially did this meta-analysis of all of the wildfire over the last 100 years and all of these historical vegetation regimes. And even though you and I work with this data set of historical vegetation, it's to me still kind of a trip. But we actually, not you and I, but somebody, really the US government has gone back and kind of reverse engineered what ecology would be around and like what fuel types would be around. And when we say fuel types in the context of this work, one fuel type would be like really thick, same size, closely packed, like Doug fir trees. And then another fuel type would be like brush. And then another fuel type would be grass. And another fuel type would be an oak savanna. So fuel being like, what is the wildfire burning through? Because we use these to pretty much do these video games, like computer models where we like are running fire simulations. But there's this data set, the Landfire data set, which looks at historical fuel types and historical vegetation regimes. So what kind of plants were here 200, 300 years ago? And we have this spatial data where you can load it up in the computer and it's like you ran a time machine back. Now you're running simulated fires according to what the landscape might have looked like, according to our best science, like 300 years ago. And this meta-analysis was done of all of the fire that's happened over the last 100 years, and it kind of ran it against a simulation of the previous fire management scheme, which was pre-contact, pre-climate change. Native American people for the last 30,000 years have been burning every piece of land out here somewhere around like the 7 to 8 year interval, kind of depending on what the management priorities were, but obviously a ton of fire. And over the last 100 years, under wildfire suppression, under colonial management, half of the fire acreage that's happened, 50% of the fires that have burned have been the same severity and frequency of fire that would have occurred under natural management, which is really interesting to me. That was a way higher number than I thought, but essentially 50% of the wildfires that happen that we talk about as catastrophes are actually mathematically pretty much what needed to happen anyways, and the other 50% is a higher severity, which is causing ecosystem damage that we wouldn't be seeing under a traditional management scheme because the fire's been neglected. So instead of kind of burning, getting rid of a lot of the fuel, burning again in 10 years, and it's not that big of a deal because there was just a fire 10 years ago, so there's only 10 years of trees to burn. Instead, now it's been 100 years and it burns really hot, and when it burns hot, it has a totally different relationship to the plants and the soil and can actually destroy a forest to the point where we might not ever see that forest regrow ever in our lifetimes, and it's more of a brush environment now or a grass environment as opposed to this kind of regenerative fire. But I thought that was really interesting. 50% of the fire that we've seen, even if we say 100,000 acres, burnt in Josephine County, the news says like 100,000 acres were devastated by wildfire. According to our latest numbers, actually 50% of that on average is good fire.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, that kind of like ties back into our conversation that we had previously about interpreting data.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, totally.
And, it's, yeah, I think that just shows that if you're seeing, I'm assuming that you're on quite a few social media platforms. I could be wrong, but I'm assuming you're keeping up to date with things. But not taking headlines for face value, doing, being like, okay, what does this actually mean? Because most of the time it's pretty dramatized in an environmental sense, but also at the same time, sometimes it's not, but you have to make that own discernment for yourself.
I'm curious for you about growing up in BC, because I know for me, I grew up in Wyoming, and I definitely remember people not liking prescribed burning, and I've also experienced that pretty infrequently, but since I started working in wildfire, I have heard that before, is that people are concerned about like escaped controlled burns, which if we're going to look at it to take the human factors out of it, to take the social factors out of it, if we're looking at it from an economic and from a landscape perspective, escaped controlled burns are 0% a concern from a technical perspective, because an escaped control burn, even if it runs 1,000 times longer than the planned control area, it's burning at a lower severity than we know the wildfire will burn. So from like just the logistical and like a ecosystem perspective, escape control burns aren't a concern. I also think that if you are really looking at the bigger picture, they shouldn't be a concern from the human perspective either, because yes, we are worried about smoke. The smoke from the wildfire is going to be worse. Yes, we are worried about damage to infrastructure. The damage to infrastructure during a wildfire at high severity is going to be worse. If we're doing burning at a time of the year where the conditions aren't in alignment for higher severity, we're going to have lower severity fire. And if we zoom out, we know we're going to have fire. And this kind of illusion that we can just prevent forest fires is falling apart for more and more of just like the general public, as we see suppression efforts being strained and like record-breaking kinds of severity. So it's interesting. I definitely feel like I'm witnessing, like I mentioned, like this wildfire thing is really bringing together people in Curry County right now. And everybody who I've talked to, I would say 90% of people are like pretty supportive of controlled burns, and 100% of the people I've talked to are supportive of fuel management and fuels reduction work. But I'm curious, could you talk a little bit about, like, do you remember in BC specifically, was prescribed burning like kind of a dirty word or a dirty concept for you growing up?
I wish I could tell you, because I honestly, not until I was really in university is when I was introduced to the concept of prescribed burning. Like I never heard anything about it. It was not really something that was openly talked about ever, unless you were actively searching for that information. And I just wasn't. So I can't really speak to that, but I can speak to the just wildfires in general in BC. Like, people are noticing, they're scared, they're very concerned about what this, like the hotter, summers, what that's going to bring, especially not so much on the coast, just because of the ecosystem that's there, but more so towards the Okanagan and the Kootenays, where it's more of a desert ecosystem. It's very, very dry. I know people up there are it's a fear.
Yeah.
That is what from the time that I started noticing the forest fires and the effects of forest fires increasing, that's the only sentiment I've gotten in BC, is just fear. But that could also be because I just wasn't in that circle at all until very recently. So now I feel, because I have a little bit more information, I don't, it's very 50-50. I find still a lot of people are for prescribed burns because it's a preventative strategy, but other people, mostly, I'm speaking about the public when I say this, are completely against it, because they just hear fire and go, absolutely not. Which I really do not blame them for feeling that way, because of the amount of devastation that's happened, especially in the past 5 years in BC. I don't know if you've, I'm assuming you've probably heard a little bit. I don't know what the news is like down in the States for all of you guys, but like the city of Lytton completely burnt in 2021. It was like the hottest day ever recorded, like 50 degrees Celsius or something abysmal like that, and the whole town burnt down. And I just actually read a book called Lytton where they talk about, the history of the town and the indigenous people and the settlers that came in and all that. And then it leads up to the fire and how the people there were concerned because it was so hot and not much was happening in terms of fire management up there. And nothing ended up being done. And now I'm pretty sure to this day, they're still cleaning up from that forest fire. So, if you're only seeing that on the news, I don't blame people in BC for being very adverse to any forest fires happening.
I think you nailed it on the head. Like my interpretation of it is that here, people in Curry County have been living with high severity, like intense, damaging wildfire for a long time. And I think that over people's entire lives gives them enough context to have a more complex relationship with fire and understand like, oh, if there's too many trees, it gets too hot and they're going to burn. If it's not this summer, the next summer. And if you're in a place like kind of the range of catastrophic wildfires, well, what I should say is like the gradients of temperature change and humidity change during the summer and drought are expanding and growing to the north, like up from the equator. If we're looking at climate change averages, even though we're getting like more winter precipitation in most of the climate change models for the Pacific Northwest, we're still also getting increased drought. So disproportionate amounts of the year's like spread of rain are just falling during the winter. And not to say by any means that like catastrophic wildfires in British Columbia are a new thing, because that would be a complete ignoring of the history of that region. But there is like a more dramatic, I think it's been a bigger change if you look at the numbers.
Yeah.
Like there's been more high severity fires with bigger acreages, even if those have always been there. Like y'all are on somewhat of an exponential increase. That even makes like our rate of growth for high severity wildfire, which is already really steep, look relatively mellow. And part of that is because so much of BC for 30,000 years has been wet and cool enough that even though there is such high density fuel types, during the year, those forests have never really, like potentially for hundreds of thousands of years, like it had to experience such high severity wildfire. And now we're dropping to these thresholds in massive landscapes that have not just like neglected fuel buildup, but are experiencing different temperature thresholds that are like just putting them on the wrong side of being prone to a high wildfire. And you can imagine that's like the worst case scenario for a fire to just really take off. And that's scary.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And yeah, it is. And I don't know personally what's going on in terms of the frequency of management happening in terms of forest fires in British Columbia. I'm still kind of, I'm still not too familiar. So I don't really want to speak too much on that. But I do, just in general, I'm sure, I don't know if anyone from BC is listening to this right now, but I fully remember the first time in my life when I saw smoke, because I grew up in Vancouver, so I was I'm on the wetter area of British Columbia. And forest fires were never really on my mind. But I do remember the first summer in high school when I seen the smoke come in from the interior and block out the sun, and it was a red sun. And we were on a air quality warning, and people were like, "This is like apocalyptic." Like it was just unheard of, and now it's expected.
Mm-hmm.
Like people just expect it to happen now, and this is within just the past 7 years, 6 years.
Yeah, not that long to experience a big change.
Actually, I would say more so 10 years, but still, like that's in terms of how fast ecosystems change. That's like second turnaround. So it's
Well, we've got
Very, very, very.
7 minutes left on the show, and I was hoping to switch gears a little bit. There's one more thing I wanted to cover, and that is just talking a little bit about like what your experience has been starting to work for Teton Topo, because the other day you sent me a really sweet and kind message that was like, oh, Teton Topo's like ruined my prospects for like getting another job because the work has been meaningful and fun, which I like completely feel the same way about. Just having started this project 2 years ago, like what we do is really meaningful and fun for me as well. And it's all I want to do. And I'm curious if you could just talk a little bit about like kind of what your plan was post grad, if you had an idea of kind of the work you were going to be doing in your master's. I'm going to just give you a lot of questions and let you choose. Like kind of what were you planning on doing with GIS? How has Teton Topo maybe been different than what you expected? And what would you like to be doing in the future with your skill set? Because I'm super grateful to have you on board. You're way more technically skilled than I am, and you're really great at what you do. And I'm really glad that we, ended up connecting. It was last April. So this is your 1 year anniversary at Teton Topo. And it's been a really wonderful ride for me. And I was wondering if you could just talk about any one of those things that seemed interesting.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Yeah. Happy 1 year anniversary. Working. Woo. Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, insane how we even met in the first place. That was like a, if for those who don't know, it was like we had a mutual friends, and my friend who I went to university with was in Hawaii, and that's where she met Dakotah. And I really have no idea to this day how that happened, but I'm very, very grateful that it did.
She was making smoothies at the farmer's market, and I said, hey, we should go surfing sometime. And she was like, you do the same kind of nerdy stuff that my best friend from back home does.
And she sent me a message that next morning getting me in contact with you, and I was like, what is this? Like this, I'm so confused. And I watched an intro video from Dakotah, and I was like, I'll give it a go. And I'm here a year later. So after my plan for after graduation was originally I was going to go right into my PhD. I had a opportunity to do a PhD here on a project that was kind of related to my master's, but a little bit different. And I decided not to, just for no bad reasons or anything. I just wasn't ready to, dive into another 6 possible years of school. I was kind of getting burnt out. And I knew that I love working in GIS because of how technical it is and how cool it is to be able to solve problems and questions or answer questions using data in this way. I didn't really have any other reason other than I just really, really enjoyed it, and I thought it was a lot of fun. So I just thought, well, if this is fun, I might as well, pursue it as a career. And then whenever you interviewed me and then invited me to come work with Teton Topo, I really had no idea what to expect. If I'm going to be honest with my thought process, I was just like, this economy is scaring me. I need a job. Yeah. And this opportunity to work in exactly what I was hoping to work in, I was like, it would be nonsense to not give it a shot. I love how, well, first of all, everybody loves working from home. That's just a beautiful bonus. But I love how collaborative it has been and how supportive you've been in this process for me, especially coming in with no wildfire knowledge really at all, and being very patient and accommodating to me has been awesome. And that's why I like, you're probably the best boss that I've really ever had. And that's why I really try to provide anything that I can, and especially to our clients as well. Like, our clients are fantastic people. I love being able to go on calls with them and talk about any questions that they might have or projects that they want done by us. And I was actually saying to one of my parents the other day, I was just like, it just doesn't feel like work. Like, I don't wake up dreading doing what I do. So I think that's a pretty good sign that you've developed a great, I say work culture when it's, us most of the time, the few of us. And But it is like, it's very welcoming and accommodating, and it never really, I don't dread waking up in the morning to work on these projects. It's a lot of fun. So
Dude, I feel the same way. And thank you for saying all of that. And it's been such a huge blessing. I mean, I was working on the Smith River complex. I met Katrina in Brookings, who runs the Northwest American Indian Coalition, and she was like, "You should make a company and come help in Brookings." I was like, "I don't know how to make a company. That's crazy," but she was really supportive for me. And then like a year into it, I was actually living part-time in Kauai still, but working remote and doing this work for the American Indian Coalition in Brookings. And yeah, I had a friend pretty quickly before I met you. Somebody was like, you should really like hire somebody. And in my brain, I was like, that's crazy. Like I would have to spend so much time explaining to them who everybody was and where I keep everything to have them on board. But then I met Amanda, who introduced me to you like a week later. And it has completely changed my life because I feel like we are together able to offer so much. And like really it is my dream to be able to use technical expertise in conjunction and parallel to traditional ecological knowledge and be able to be of service to communities and landscapes. And yeah, you've really like not just doubled but like ×5 the capacity that we have at Teton Topo. So thank you. And Hannah, thank you for being on the show. I'll let you say goodbye to everybody because we're pretty much at the top of our hour.
For sure. Well, thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate you inviting this Canadian onto your show today. So this has been awesome.
It's been awesome to have you, Hannah. Thank you. You can check out the work we do at www.tetontopo.com. I'd like to thank Rick McNamer, our sponsor here at KCIW. And like I said, the ongoing work of the Wild Rivers Coast Forest Collaborative and the Northwest American Indian Coalition. I'm Dakotah Daily. I've been here with Hannah Green, and you're listening to the Daily Weekly. Thanks, everybody.